The reserve market model is a new graph that is introduced to the AP Macroeconomics course for the spring 2023 exam. It is not in your textbook, therefore, this recording is your primary source of information, but not your only source. I will provide additional links on Google Classroom to other recordings to assist with your understanding. Imagine that you are home and you see this man on your smartphone. It is reported that he made an announcement, and politicians and, more importantly, businesses respond with their perspectives. This man is Jerome Powell, and he is the chair of the Federal Reserve. And the announcement he made is that of interest rates. Interest rates are one measure of economic growth. If you recall from previous studies, the role of the Federal Reserve is to maintain price stability, and this is done through monetary policy. Jerome Powell's announcement has great implications because once it is made, banks make their decisions on placing interest rates on loans for items such as cars, houses, businesses, personal, etc. As a result, consumers and businesses base their decisions or spending on what the banks have announced, and as a result, it affects the overall economy through prices and employment. The interest rate that Jerome Powell announced was the federal funds rate, also known internationally as the policy rate. I will use these terms interchangeably from time to time throughout this recording. It is the interest rate that banks charge other banks for overnight lending. Commercial banks such as Wells Fargo and Banks of America keep funds in their respective vaults at the Fed and conduct several transactions like this if they believe they do not have enough required reserves. The Fed oversees these transactions and determines the policy rate based on the supply and demand. In other words, the Fed attempts to reach a target federal funds rate based on how often the banks borrow and lend from each other. Before 2008, monetary policy was conducted in three ways: the reserve requirement, the discount rate, where the Fed loans funds to banks, and through open market operations. Open market operations was the primary action of monetary policy, and all three was done with what was called limited reserves. Limited reserves are funds that banks hold in their vaults and the deposits that they maintain at the central bank. And we have two models or graphs that illustrate what happens when the Fed chair makes those announcements. The money market graph, which explains the changes in the short run, and the loanable funds graph, which explains the changes in the long run. However, after the Great Recession in 2008 and the global pandemic in 2020, financial markets, primarily in the United States, greatly adjusted their monetary policy, which is now open market operations, the discount rate, and interest on reserves, where the central bank pays interest to the banks on their required and excess reserves in their vaults. As a result, interest on reserves is now the primary action of monetary policy. If you've noticed, I have added a star next to the discount rate and interest on reserves. The reason for this is because those two practices are known as administered interest rates. This term means that these are interest rates that are determined by the Federal Reserve, unlike the policy rate, which is determined by the supply and demand of bank transactions. So you probably have two questions. One, what happened to the reserve requirement? And two, why is the interest on reserves the primary action of monetary policy? The answer to both questions is ample reserves. Ample reserves is when the central bank has abundant reserves and as a result does not influence the policy rate. As a result, the global pandemic of 2020, the Fed reduced the reserve requirement from 10% to 0%. They did increase the reserve requirement back to 10% at one point, but reduced it back to 0% due to the banks gaining interest on the reserves that they had in their vault. Therefore, from here on out, the Fed has established that for limited reserves, the reserve requirement is a necessity, but not for ample reserves. As a result of the use of ample reserves, a new model was introduced, and that graph is known as the reserve market model. It illustrates the changes in the supply of reserves with limited versus ample reserves in the short run. On your vertical axis, you have the policy rate. You also have a vertical curve that represents the supply of reserves. It is vertical because the Fed determines the quantity. Therefore, it intersects with the horizontal axis, which represents the quantity of reserves. There is also a three-pronged reserve demand curve, which we will explain in the second recording. So this is another model that is similar to the money market graph that explains the changes in funds in the short run, with the difference that the money market graph provides the nominal interest rate. We will discuss the shifts in the next recording.